2 videos ago I mentioned that I got 4 questions. The first was on toe numbers, the second was on foot pads. Answered both of those in the previous video, so now we'll look at distinguishing the front tracks from the hind tracks. The first clue to distinguishing front from hind feet is the fact that a foot has to be large enough to support whatever the weight is above it. And that's why elephants have feet like this instead of feet like a mouse. The same principle holds true for the front half and the back half of the animal. Whichever half has the greatest mass needs the biggest feet. So if we divide an animal visually in half, starting at about the last rib, you can see that the front half of this coyote has more mass than the back half. So you'd expect the front feet to be larger, and they are. That's also true for deer and for felines. Apply the same principle to this raccoon. That's the midsection at about where the last rib would be. The back half has more mass than the front half, so you'd expect the back feet to be longer than the front feet, and they are. And the same is true for bears. What about long tubular animals like the ferrets and weasels? They look, front and back, just about the same. So I wouldn't expect to see very much difference in size between the front and the back feet. And there isn't when you see the prints. Anatomically, the front feet are larger, but sometimes the back feet show larger than the front feet. So it's kind of a toss-up. And that fits the body build. So that's the first clue. How is the animal built? A second clue for distinguishing front and back comes from the track pattern itself. A track pattern in which the hind foot lands directly on top of the front foot is called a direct register track. That can show up, for example, in these 2 forms on the left. The direct register lope, which you'll see among weasels, each one of these prints has 2 foot tracks in it. A front with a hind on top of it. A direct register walk, or a direct register trot, has the same situation. 2 prints in 2 tracks in one print, 2 tracks in one print, etc., all the way through, because they direct register. And so the print that's on the top is always the hind foot. Just a cautionary note, there is a pattern that looks like a direct register lope, but is not. And that's called the canid trot or canine trot or dog trot or side trot. And in this trot, all of the front feet show up on one side of the direction of travel line, and all of the hind feet show up on the other side. And you might as well say always the one that is furthest toward the direction of travel is the hind foot. So if you see this pattern and it was made by a canine, this is always the hind foot. Now just a caution, another caution, in the rotary gallop, which you saw in the OSIC video, we assume, since it's a gallop, that this is front, front, hind, hind. But there are times when the distance between groups is not very great, and you're never quite sure whether this is the pattern or this is the pattern. And that's why it's always important to measure the prints. So that's the second clue, the track pattern itself. The third category of clues for distinguishing front from back comes from details of the print itself. In a badger, notice that the front claws are much longer than the back claws. The same is true of the striped skunk. So when you see that difference, assuming you know the species you're dealing with, you can sometimes distinguish the front from the hind just by claw length. Sometimes details of the shape of the print give you the clue for making the distinction. These are possum tracks, and notice this big old opposable thumb here. A, it does not have a claw. B, it's pretty unmistakable. So when you see that big thing sticking out to the side, you know I've got a hind print. Another detail that you can use to distinguish front from hind is the length of the print. As you know, this is a black bear, and as you know, plantigrade walkers typically have a longer hind foot than a front foot, and that's the case here. And plantigrade is the distinction we made in the previous video. These are bobcat prints, and the hind on this species is much more symmetrical. If you folded it in half left to right, the pads would pretty much line up with each other. But notice on the hind foot, toe number 3 is way higher than toe 4 and toe 2, and so it's not symmetrical. And noticing a detail like that when you're studying the print can also be a clue that in this case you have a front foot. Sometimes the front foot will be more symmetrical than the back. You have to pay attention to the species. There are other clues as well, such as soil movement or pressure releases, which we have not yet talked about, and the fact, as you saw 2 videos ago with the raccoon prints, often the front foot splays out more than the hind foot does. So there are 3 kinds of clues that you can use to distinguish front from back. It does take study of the species. I hope this encourages you to both study the species and to satisfy your curiosity by getting out there and seeing how you can apply some of this information to the tracks. See you on down the trail.